Our scripture this morning is from Acts chapter 20, verses 7 through 12. On the first day of the week, when we had met to break bread, Paul was holding a discussion with them, and since he intended to leave the next day, he continued speaking until midnight. There were many lamps in the room upstairs where we were meeting. A young man named Eutychus, who was sitting in the window, began to sink off into a deep sleep while Paul talked still longer. Overcome by sleep, he fell to the ground 3 floors below and was picked up dead. But Paul went down and, bending over him, took him in his arms and said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is still in him." Then Paul went upstairs, and after he'd broken bread and eaten, he continued to converse with them until dawn and then left. Meanwhile, they had taken the boy away alive and were not just a little comforted. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This next week, I will be away for meetings and a church gathering in Louisville, Kentucky. Next Sunday's sermon will be me on video. It's pre-recorded, it'll all be plugged in. If the video doesn't work, Serena and Jonathan and Lisa all volunteered to take turns doing an impression of me reading the manuscript. So it'll all be fine. But either way, you don't have a guest preacher next week. And hearing the scripture you've just heard, you're welcome. Preaching until dawn, Paul was. Again, you're welcome. So for the next 5 hours, actually, there's probably more important messages out of this text than the length of sermons, but boy, does that just seem to jump out. So what jumps out to you? There's a lot of stuff going on here. It's a short passage. We've read some really long ones recently. This one's really short, but it's busy. There's a lot going on in it. So think, what jumped out of that for you? Was it the food? Was it the idea that communion, that breaking bread together, was already that integral to the community's identity that early in the ancient church? Was it the preaching? The idea that Paul could just go on and on and on? Some of the kids may be asking, is this proof adults really can talk you to death? So what jumps out to you? Is it the healing? The fact that they went down, healed a kid, they got up and went home and went back to business as usual. There's a potluck inside, let's not let it get cold. What jumps out to you from this text? For me, it's the character of Eutychus. I can't get around Eutychus. After 25 years of doing youth work before selling out and taking a pulpit, the number of young people who Eutychus reminds me of are legion. I've met so many who remind me of Eutychus in my life. And in this story, I want to invite you to put yourself in Eutychus' shoes. Scripture describes him as a young man, so it probably fits our category of youth. A teenager, maybe older elementary. I want to invite you to put yourself in Eutychus' shoes. As a young person, his day may have started out something like this. Eutychus, get up! We're going to church! Oh, Mom, we converted. Do we still have to do all those old things? What's your attitude, young man? We have a guest today. Paul's coming. You better be on your best behavior. Eutychus gets ready, reluctantly showers, gets ready, goes to the house where they're having church. There's an upper room. A lot of houses in this time had the kitchen with the main fire and things on the first level, so heat could rise up. Light could shine upward. So the living area, the gathering area, the eating area would have been up higher. The upper room where they had the meal, for example. So they go to this upper room to gather, And it says there are many lights. This would have been oil lamps or candles. Eutychus shows some common sense. Leave it to youth to find the practical need in the room. He goes to a cracked window in the midst of a hot room, getting away from a crowd of adults, getting out of the heat and finding some fresh air. He sits up in this windowsill as the heat of the lamps just grows, as the heat of the people, the body heat, compounds it, and as smells and senses and smoke from the cook fire in the kitchen start to waft their way up. He sits in the windowsill as Paul goes on and on and on. And you got to think Eutychus at some point says, "What is that they're cooking for dinner?" Now, church, we've read Paul before, right? We can only assume he spoke like he wrote. More words than necessary, saying the same thing more often than necessary, and sometimes difficult to understand even on the third time around. If Paul spoke anything like he writes, we can easily put ourselves in Eutychus' shoes, right? Paul is talking, Eutychus is trying to listen, in the window, trying to keep some fresh air, feeling kind of alone, feeling kind of isolated. The heat's getting to them, and they drift off until suddenly they fall. Until they fall. I wonder, was Eutychus thinking about something really cool when he fell asleep? Was he dreaming of biscuits or flatbreads down below? Was he thinking about what he was going to do with his friends later? Was he contemplating some deep theological thing that Paul had put on the table? Did anyone notice that Eutychus was drifting off? Did anyone try to stir him? Was his mom sitting nearby with a sharp elbow along the way? Were friends across the room in another window shooting spitwads across the room at their sleeping friend? I wonder if there was any sound before he hit the ground. I wonder, did anyone see him slipping towards the outside? Did anyone try to reach him? Did anyone try to reach him? When you're in a closet, it's hard for people to reach you. Locked away, isolated. When you constantly feel the need to say you're fine so no one knows how hard things truly are, how can anyone know when you're not fine? How can anyone see you drift away? When you've compartmentalized your faith and your ethics at work, does anyone know your true face? Can they see the sadness or loneliness in your eyes? Can they see your heart melting away in the heat of life? When you bury your anger and fear and pain long enough, do you even know when you're about to boil over? Does anyone feel close enough that you might talk to them or share it? Or have you pushed everyone so far away they could never catch you if you fell? Brothers and sisters, church family, people fall out of windows every day. People fall out of windows every day. And some have isolated themselves so much we never know about the fall until we hear the thud. Sometimes we're so surprised by the fall because they've projected fine for so long, we've received fine as their normal. People fall out of windows every day. Some of us have compartmentalized the pieces of our life and we dwell in the one that feels safe so often we're not even aware when we're about to fall. We've told ourselves a story of fineness so long. We've said okay so many times, we've started to believe our own story as we sit in the window as the heat of life gets to us. People fall out of windows every day. Young people are cutting themselves, desperate to feel something or to punish themselves for how they feel. Adults are trying to reinvent themselves, trying to find a life that makes them happy. But some can't find it and will do whatever they have to distract themselves from the pain. Seniors are smiling politely while feeling more and more alone as friends and loved ones pass away, move away, drift away. Church, people fall out of windows every day. Sometimes it is the addiction that is our notice that they've hit the ground. Sometimes it's when someone says, whatever happened to them, and we realize their absence with a thud. Sometimes it's the loss of their life that reminds us we had stopped paying attention to theirs. People fall out of windows every day. Sometimes we notice, we reach out, we try to ease their fall the best we can. Sometimes we reach out trying to ease our guilt for having not noticed what they were going through. Sometimes we cry out to God knowing that our hands aren't enough and feeling helpless in the midst of their need. Sometimes we don't notice till they've hit the ground. We're shocked by the fall and feel helpless in how to respond. We're willing to help, but we're frozen by the enormity of need. We feel stuck because our own need is so overwhelming and we need help ourselves. In our story today, Eutychus falls 3 stories and they think him dead. It is such a frightening event that everything stops for a moment. Then when all seems well, Paul goes back to preaching. In our story, a boy is thought dead, and then they share a meal and get back to their sermon. Church, it's not about the preaching. It's about the people. I could never preach another sermon and we would be just as good a church for it, as long as we're caring for each other. We could never dive any deeper into the gospel than we have already and would be just as good a church for it, as long as we are loving each other. There are a lot of really good sermons about responding to people in times of need. You can Google sermons on caring for others and you'll get more content than you can ever keep up with. But I think as a church, we're called to do more than to respond to those in need. We're definitely called to do more than heap on more judgment and pain in the midst of the sorrow people are already carrying. Ben Franklin's old line, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It's not about a sermon preventing us from doing the bad things. It's about relationships that catch one another when the bad stuff around us hits close to home. It's not about a preacher scaring you into right behavior. It's about a community coming together to love each other and make sure the words of comfort and affirmation are always being heard. I think we're called to know each other so well that we know when someone is falling. We're called to know each other well enough so that when Alex says he's doing fine, somebody else says BS if he's not. We're called to know each other well enough so that when Mary Helen says things are okay, the other rainbow moms in the church go, we can see it in her eyes. It's not okay. We're called to know each other well enough so when somebody says, how are you doing? We can go, good, but how are you? Because you can see them putting on the friendly face. We're called to know each other well enough, to spend time with each other, to check in, to ask questions, to trust each other with our hearts. I think we're called to know each other well enough to know when someone is falling. And God knows those people aren't all in this room. Church family is only one piece of the community we live in, right? Who do you know in your life that is feeling the heat right now? Who is under pressure? Who do you know that's struggling to catch their breath? Who do you know that's creeping to a window, searching for fresh air in the midst of all the trouble that swirls? Who do you know that is teetering on the edge, about to fall? This isn't a question about sin and falling into darkness. It's a question about falling into our own pits. It's about hurting ourselves, hurting those around us, lashing out at ourselves and others, feeling like we're not good enough. Who do you know that's about to fall out of a window? A friend of mine tells the story of a young man in a church he started serving back in Kentucky. Roger and his mom had moved down from Michigan after his dad died. It was just the two of them. They moved in with some relatives there and showed up at their church, the family church, and came in and sat on the back row the first week. Roger was 6'2", hard to miss. Yet everything about him begged people not to notice. He slumped down in his chair and hoped everyone would just leave him alone. After worship, there was a meeting of the church leaders, and my friend lifted up Roger and his family in their prayer time and said, we have this new family that have come down. They've got other family around, but not a lot. They really need some love around them, especially the son, Roger. He's young and he needs church to support him. Miss Dottie was one of the older leaders in the church in her 80s and said, "Who are you talking about?" And they described Roger to her, and she goes, "How is there a youth over 6 foot tall that I have not seen in church?" They said, "Well, he sits in the back row. He kind of comes in late." She goes, "I'm going to watch out for this one." The next week, Miss Dottie is watching. She sees Roger in the back row. After worship, she makes a beeline for him, but the back row is empty when she gets there. She heads out to the parking lot. She finds Roger in the car where he's already hiding, waiting on his mom. And Miss Dottie starts pecking on the window. Roger, right? You're Roger? He just rolls the window down. She says, "Yes." Just, "I'm Miss Dottie. Get out here. I need to give you a hug." She pulls the kid out of the car. This small little woman hugs him and says, "I'm going to be watching for you every week. You're going to be in my prayers. If you need anything, remember, my name's Miss Dottie, and I'm here for you." The next week, she heads to the back. He's gone. She gets to the car. She pecks on the window. She drags him out. She hugs him, lets him back in the car, and goes her way. 3 weeks, she has to peck on the window and drag him out of the car. The 4th week, he just sits in the back row. Miss Dottie hugs him, and then he slinks off to the car. That becomes the routine. Eventually, she hugs him, and he stays. They have a short conversation. Not much. He's a kid of few words, but he stays. One day, Roger and his mom are on their drive home. They're almost home when he says, "Hey, Mom, what about that lady?" "You're going to have to use more words, Roger." "You know, the one that's always hugging me." "You mean Miss Dottie?" He said, "Yeah, she didn't hug me today." His mom says, "Well, you must not have heard the prayer concern time. She's in the hospital, and she's not doing real well." He says, "Okay." They're really close to home now when Roger says, "Is the hospital on the way home?" And in a brilliant moment of parenting, the mother says, yes, it is. Turns around, goes to the opposite side of town to the hospital. Roger is 6'2". He clearly outpaces his mother into the hospital. Mom eventually finds the room, gets there, and in a second wonderful act of parenting does not walk in, but records this story that we get to hear today. She watches and listens as Roger is holding Miss Dottie's hand and says, Miss Dottie, you're going to be okay. And she says, well, I'm not sure when you went to medical school, Roger, but the doctors tell me it's not good. He says, no, you're going to be okay, in a fervent voice. He says, Roger, God and I have talked about this, and if I get better, that's good. And if I don't, I'm okay. He goes, no, you don't understand, Miss Dottie. You're going to get better. She says, Roger, what's gotten into you? What's this about? And he goes, I've been praying for you every day. You're going to get better. She goes, Roger, you got this backwards. I've been praying for you. And he goes, no, Miss Dottie, you've been saving my life. You've been saving my life. Church, people fall out of windows every day. Every day. Through the discipline of prayer, the stubbornness of love, Miss Dottie gives us a story of resurrection through relationship, saving Roger's life. And she would probably say Roger saved hers too. You may have had someone do the same for you. You may be able to think back at who reached out at just the right time, who stuck by you when you wouldn't stick by yourself. And we can give thanks for that. But as a church, we are called to stop and think about who God has put into our lives. Not just who did God send to us, but who has God put next to us. Who are you in a position to love? The church isn't about keeping each other on the straight and narrow. The church is about holding on to each other when the world falls apart. Who has God put in your circle of influence? Who can you help that no one else would allow in? Who has God sent you to nag with compassion? Who has God put you in a position to love? It's an important question because someone you know is about to fall out of a window, and they are praying that you will save them. Someone is about to fall out a window and they are trusting that God will notice. They're not saying anything, they're just saying they're fine. And they are praying that God will notice that they're not. And that someone will respond. Churches are not about sermons, they're not about offering amounts, they're not about attendance, they're not about butts in pews or any of that stuff. It's about people. Church is about people. We are the answer to someone's prayer. And someone is the answer to yours. It's about people. People fall out of windows every day. We're the church. God sent us to notice.